So thank you very much for being here, and I'd really like to obviously thank the Radcliffe Institute for all that they've done to facilitate this strange adventure. And in particular, I'd like to welcome those of you who are from disciplines other than mine, because I don't think anybody from my discipline is here, which is fine. Because people in my discipline don't usually do this sort of thing, and only at a place like the Radcliffe can you expand your wings a bit and try something different. This exploration, which is really at the beginning, we start in September, and because it was a late start this year, we've been at this less than 2 months, is outside but overlapping my direct area of work and research. But I did sort of run a trial balloon and ran it by some others in related fields. We did an exploratory seminar about a year ago, and Radcliffe came to the rescue to keep this idea going, to see what would come of it. I was surprised and gratified to get this fellowship. I'd like to give special thanks to the Bradley family who helped make this possible. And also to say that I was glad when I was looking into the Radcliffe Fellowship to look at a promotional video for the Radcliffe Institute, and I saw Professor Faust saying, not all these projects go anywhere. So I felt relieved that I would not be totally on the hook to actually necessarily make it be a success, because that's what exploration is. That's what exploration is in science, and that's also what exploration is in medicine. So what I hope to cover in this talk are 3 themes, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time, there are mixed metaphors. You're going to be swimming in metaphors, and I hope you can keep them straight, because I struggle with it myself. There are many, many disciplines upon which we will touch in this exploration and in this talk, and I will tell you up front, most of them I know almost nothing about. So there may be those of you who came to this talk seeing it publicized and knowing quite a bit about the disciplines that I'm going to be skating on the surface of, and you're going to say to yourself, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And I'm telling you right now, you're right. So what I would ask you is, contribute. Talk to me afterwards. Be part of this. If you think that the idea has any worth, and even if you think the idea doesn't have any worth, I'd still like your contribution, because as a scientist, you don't want to have a theory that you then find evidence to support. You want to have a question which you then find evidence to refute or direct further inquiry. There are 3 specific aims that we're trying to accomplish this year in this project, and I put the picture of books there because, in fact, it's all book research. People have said, are you going to put patients in an MRI scanner? Are you going to be putting deep brain electrodes in? And no, we're really basically reading and thinking and asking questions. And your input truly is welcome, any of you. My goal for this talk is modest. I hope that by the end, you'll at least know what the title means. So each of us brings to our efforts in life our background. And I will say that I think the single thing that has pushed this into my effort sphere has been a tendency that I didn't know the word for until I started this project. And the word is biophilia, and I have it bad. This is a picture I took hiking 2 weeks ago on one of those beautiful fall days. And my whole life has been spent wallowing in biophilia. And for those of you, most of you maybe have heard this term. It was popularized here at Harvard by Professor Wilson. It was actually coined by the psychologist Erich Fromm. And it's the idea that we inherently, genetically, have an affinity for things that are natural and alive. And I'm not 100% convinced that we know that this is inherent in our genes. There's some suggestive evidence that's quite good. But I also think it may be imprinting, and I sometimes think that, like the little ducks following Konrad Lorenz around here, I imprinted on trees. And for that reason, this condition has been part of my life for a long time. Now, there's another thing I've learned since starting down this exploratory pathway, which is there's a flip side of biophilia, and there's a term for it, which I didn't know. This is where Radcliffe comes in useful. It's called eco-depression, and it almost sounds like a joke. Eco-depression. But in fact, there is a study of this topic of eco-depression, and I can tell you that once I started reading about this, I can say unequivocally, I suffer from this in a big way. And every time that I see a forest that used to be where I grew up, now plowed down to make another housing development or a strip mall, Every time I fly over the United States and I look down and it's nothing as far as the eye can see but cultivated land, I think of the fox and what's that mother fox, where are they going to go? I have a nurse practitioner who is Southern, and she taught me the expression, "It hurts my soul." And that's how it feels. And I bet some of you who are here because you feel similarly. Since college, I was in college at Brown in the 70s, it was liberal era, and we were really worried about overpopulation. And I still worry about overpopulation. I worry about this when I'm in crowds, when I travel around the world and I see crowds, and you think, what is going to happen to all these people? And it's still going on. And when you see the effects of what humans have done, and you know, they can be very emotion-grabbing effects like the ones you see at the bottom of the slide. So that's what we call eco-depression. So that's the substrate on which this project arose. And we're really going to be pulling together, attempting to pull together threads from many different sources. We may end up at the bottom on the right, a big mess, and nothing may come that's useful. We're looking to see if we can find something that's interesting and maybe even has utility, like you see on the left, but it's still early. So we have 3 specific aims for this year, and thank heavens, the Radcliffe Institute lets you have research partners. So I have 5 brilliant, enthusiastic undergraduates, and I picked them for their specialties, for their majors. They're all upper class students, and I have an environmental psychology student. I have other psychology students with interests in public health. I have basic neuroscience students. I have environmental science students, people with background in economics. So we have some diversity on purpose to try to have them be my, as we say in the immunology world, effector arms, go out there and, to mix metaphors, to go on safari and find stuff and bring it back. So we're hoping to write a thesis. Whether this becomes a book or not, I'm trying not to be too ambitious. We're designing an interdisciplinary course to see if people are interested in exploring this across disciplines on a more ongoing basis. And then the last thing is also an ambitious part, which I won't talk much about, although anybody that wants to talk more to me about this, I'd be happy to bring this back to my world in neurosurgery in children, to work towards an experimental green children's hospital, looking at whether the reward system could be capitalized upon to make work even more rewarding because of the pro-social aspect of this. So what are we talking about here? I just want to say a thanks at this point for the trial balloon that we put out about a year ago when I got together a few colleagues in the clinical neurosciences. Alice Flaherty was absolutely essential. She's a brilliant neurologist and also has an appointment in psychiatry and has written books and was a Radcliffe Fellow, which is kind of how I got here. And Zaleem Elibol is a young, ambitious, very bright child neurologist who specializes in adolescence. And we came up with this idea, and we wanted to put on a seminar, and the person who tipped the scales for me was Dan Schrag at the Harvard University Center for the Environment, who agreed to sponsor this exploratory effort. And we pulled together a variety of willing and incredibly generous people from different disciplines, including environmental science, behavioral economics, neuroscience of various sorts, psychology, and so forth. And we just got together and went through a series of questions to explore whether or not this idea might have teeth, as we say. And it was very, very useful. So what are we talking about with these threads and this metaphor? Well, we're talking about pulling together themes, and I'll elaborate on this in a moment. And in addition, we're looking for data. So as a person trained in science, I don't want to just have themes. I want to see what data are out there that could support, refute, or modify these ideas of how things might be connected. This is really about connections. So let's go on this journey together. So theme 1. Theme 1 is this. There are big problems beyond our daily workplace, and maybe they deserve our attention. And so you could argue that this is a midlife crisis, this is biophilia, why don't you just quit your job and go be an environmental scientist? And I will tell you that about 15 years ago I thought about that, because I thought that the environment was the biggest problem facing us. I thought, bar none. Now, we might get hit by an asteroid, there might be a pandemic, there might be a nuclear annihilation, but the one we can see and the one that we know about is this one. And I actually went to the head of environmental science at Brown and said, should I like change careers because I really think this is important? And he said, no, you should work within your field. And that's sort of part of the genesis of this. And here is my daily life. You can see it. These are children. Here I am in surgery. These are children with brain tumors, with terrible traumas to their brain, with epilepsy, with areas of the brain that are causing abnormal electrical activity that's disabling the child and happens to be intersected perfectly with the child's dominant hand cortex. These are children with tumors that will cause their death if they're not removed and will cause paralysis if not removed today. These are children with congenital problems. The child in the bottom right has a malformed skull that needs to be taken apart and put back together safely without harming the brain. And this is what my day consists of, and my life. And it's very easy to get narrow and to get very caught up in it and to be quite satisfied. But I was nagged because of this disease of biophilia and eco-depression that there may be something else to be done. And I think the thing that tipped the scales for me was this particular article. Now, those of you who are in environmental science are the true scientists, but then there are those people who make this available and bring it to the attention of the public. This was an article not in the Scientific Journal, but it was in the Atlantic. It was part of a millennial series that the Atlantic Monthly put out right around 2000. This came out in 1998. They had a series of these, of big ideas for the millennium. And Bill McKibben is one of the most prominent environmental writers in the US today. And this was a three-part article called A Special Moment in History. And it changed the way that I thought, and I think it changed my life trajectory. I kind of thought population was the problem. And this article, whether those of you who know more about this than I may disagree, so I grant you that. But this was the article that showed that in historical time, from 1750s up to the current time that this was written, there has been, as we now know, but in 1998, I was less aware of it. I knew a little bit about it, but it hadn't really sunk in that this was my problem. And it shows this dramatic change in carbon in the atmosphere due to different sources. And as for those of you in the visual arts, I know a lot of my fellows are here. Look at this beautiful way of showing this superimposed on that eco-depressive smokestack that kind of lines up with it. Isn't that a beautiful way to make you feel bad about it and effectively? And this graph is, I've changed the scale here so that this is, these are on the same scale here. And this is global carbon output. Carbon being the metric we can study easily and is a metric for greenhouse gases in general, although I recognize it's not the whole problem. And this is the United States, and you can just see the difference between where the whole world is and where the United States is. This map, of course, shows the high output countries, and we're right up there. We're right up there despite the fact that our population is much smaller. And the metaphor that Bill McKibben in this article used that made a big impact on me was this one of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day balloons, okay? So he says that in the United States, if you talk about how much carbon each of us produces in our daily life, through things we consume, through the travel that we do, through things at our workplace, through our houses and the heat that's wasted, through the food that we eat, it gives us an amount. And we carry around an amount like the biggest Macy's Thanksgiving Day balloon, whereas these places with growing populations have much, much smaller kind of at the sidelines on the parade balloons. And therefore, the point that he made that made an effect on me is, this is us. This is our problem. This is our responsibility, which I had not really felt prior to this. This is the population expected to grow over time. This is where the United States is now. These are the ones that are up and coming. And if those people all live like we live, we cannot stop that tide, is the impression I came away with. So what are the fixes? Well, technologic advances, carbon-independent energy sources. For those of you who have not seen it, this is a still from the video that you can get online that went viral called Solar Roads. People can complain whether solar roads are practical, but it's a great video. It's a crowdsourcing video, and it's persuasive, although those in the technical fields have their criticisms of it. Geoengineering, many of you know about this. Many of you are very interested in this. Some of you may do this. Population control is critical, but I don't need to tell anybody here how difficult that is and how many factors of economics, religion, and other things go into making that difficult. And then there's behavioral change. which we think about when we think about it, about our own lives. Should I recycle? Should I do this? Should I do that? But if you really think about it, all the things on that list will involve behavioral change. It isn't just what we individually do, it's what we collectively value. And so I think behavioral change is a key ingredient that cannot be ignored, whether it's on the individual level, the societal level, or the governmental level. This also came from Bill McKibben's paper, and at the time, here was my reaction, which I've kept, and was the genesis for this project. And he says, one would think offhand that compared to changing the number of children we bear, changing consumption patterns would be a breeze. Fertility, after all, is biologic, hardwired, like Darwin said. But, he says in his paper, I would guess that it is easier to change fertility than lifestyle. And he concludes, based on this population curve, that we simply won't live simply enough, soon enough, to solve the problem. Now, talk about eco-depression. Nothing we can do about it. But at the time when I read this in 1998, as a practicing neurosurgeon who has an interest in behavior, a background in psychology, and an interest in those aspects of neurosurgery that have to do with brain and behavior, that didn't seem surprising to me. And the reason it didn't seem surprising is that simplification is hard. And the reason simplification is hard has to do with our brains. So that was theme 1. This will pull together, I hope. But now we're going to move on to theme 2, which I'm calling our brains ourselves, for those of you who are old enough, our bodies ourselves. We're in the right place for that. So here's the principle. It's more fun to get more than to do with less. And another way of saying that is that we like to get stuff. Now, when you illustrate getting stuff, you usually have women with shopping bags, but I have guys in a bike shop. Because in my family, the guys in the bike shop spend as much as the women with the shopping bags. I'm being sexist here, but I just like to put guys shopping on this picture. And another way of saying that is, it is more fun, or you can say rewarding, or you can say satisfying, to get more, or to do more, or to experience more, than it is to simplify. And we know this inherently. This is a travel poster trying to get you to travel. We love to travel, get new experiences. This is solitary confinement. It's torture. And this is not made up. This is explained by how our brains work. So what do I mean? Our brains evolved for survival. You all see those squirrels out there getting those nuts right now. You step on those nuts when you're walking, don't you? And they're doing it for a reason. Their brains and our brains have this in common. Early humans had this in common. They stored their fish. They had shelter. This was survival. And people who are somewhat at the extreme end of the belief in behavior and genetics, write books like, and get these concepts across, the selfish gene that says that our bodies are basically just the carriers for the genes, which are really the elements of importance, and that we're just, carrying machines. Be that as it may, our brains evolved for survival, and some of the ways we are make perfect sense from that point of view. And in order to accomplish this, certain things had to be rewarding. We needed to develop a reward system, which is present in virtually all organisms if you look for it and think about it in that way. And in humans, it's exquisitely well developed, and it happens to be at a time right now when this circuitry and its interactions are being explosively understood in new ways. And the reasons for that is that the way we used to understand what does what in the brain is through lesions, accidental or otherwise. Some of you have seen the Phineas Gage exhibit here on the campus. And this was a tamping iron that went through someone's frontal lobe and changed his behavior and his reward system. Those were the kinds of clues we used to have to go on to figure out where things were and how they acted in the brain. People with strokes, people with tumors, people with surgery, the kinds of things I do. But now we have new tools to see why this is rewarding and what happens and why this child is so ecstatic with figuring out that a butterfly landed there and now landed here. And it's being explored at an increasing frequency and sophistication by two techniques. One is deep brain stimulation, which was originally designed to treat people with diseases. And now, even though people have diseases that get these, no people volunteer, yeah, I'll sign up for that study, put a deep brain stimulator in just for fun. Using deep brain stimulation in many different networks of the brain for various conditions has created enormous opportunity to study how this system works. Functional MRI is another type of study which also has been revolutionized in the last decade. It's task-based sometimes. You can do this and this part of your brain will change its blood flow enough that a magnet can pick it up. There's resting state fMRI which picks up what's connected to what. And now my former resident, Kendall Lee, has figured out a way to do deep brain stimulation in an MRI scanner in a magnetic environment. It's kind of amazing, using carbon fibers and Bluetooth, and figure out how to do functional MRI and deep brain stimulation at the same time to actually see how these networks work and are modulated. And it's really quite extraordinary. So I'm not going to say that I or that the field knows everything about it, but what we do know is increasing in complexity minute to minute. The problem is perhaps as follows. So our brain's evolved with this wonderful system, but it doesn't know when to stop. And so now your urges to eat get you into trouble. And your urges to get stuff are getting the planet into trouble, or both. And so our brains are still living in some other era when this was not so problematic. But it has become problematic. And what neuroscience gives, in my mind, is an arm's length tool to not judge it. To not say, you're a jerk for having a house like that. Don't you know better than to eat that? It's to hold it at arm's length objectively and say, what is it that makes good, well-intentioned people who don't really want to see the planet destroyed do this? What is it about our brains that promotes this kind of behavior, or makes it hard to change, or hard to simplify? So, as proof, what's more fun? To look at the kind of car you're going to get, pick out the color, pick out the model, or look at the gas mileage? And what's more fun? To decorate your house, to get furniture for that front porch and think about what the trim color is going to be, or to put insulation in your attic? So the reward system for those behaviors that are increasing the problem are just greater than those things that tell you to contract, do less, be sensible, in many ways, is the theory that we're exploring. I'm not saying that I know the answer. I'm saying that some of this seems to be, as one might say, common sense, but common sense from a brain point of view. And what we've been exploring in our project, my students and I, is the evidence to support or refute this idea. One of the interesting paradoxes is that stuff doesn't even make us happy. So, you know, if you're starving, food makes you happy, of course. If you're cold, a warm sweater makes you happy. But there now are, and many of these came out of Harvard as well, many happiness studies. There's a whole field of happiness that didn't exist when I was in the beginning of my journeys. And it turns out that relationships and meaning and experience all make you happier in the long term than stuff. But stuff makes you happy at the moment. And a former professor of mine has come back into my consciousness, and I've been working with him on this. A neuroscientist named Peter Sterling, who studied the visual system but also is interested in this. And it's his belief that the evidence suggests that the reward system that we evolved with and that we still have today, all of us sitting here, is tuned to small, unexpected, and variable rewards. We're tuned because we evolved at a time of relatively consistent misery. We were pretty much always hungry and pretty much always cold and wet and physically uncomfortable. So the biggest rewards come from a patch of sun that you can stand in for a minute, or 10 berries that you find in the wayside. And that his idea is that the way we live our lives, our rewards, we need more and more and more rewards because they're not like this anymore. They're consistent, they're predictable, and we need more and more and more of them. It's his belief that this is part of the explanation for certain kinds of addiction and certain kinds of alienation in modern life. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily am going to go all that way, but it's an interesting theory. Now, I've talked about rewards that generally we think of as bad. They're consumptive rewards. We eat too much, we have too much stuff, our houses are too big, our carbon footprint's enormous. But let's talk about other kinds of rewards. Humans evolved to be rewarded by new insights. How many of you have seen a child with a puzzle, with a new toy, with a new playroom, with an outside? Go and explore it. This is normal behavior from rats, probably from paramecia, all the way to human children. And human children in particular are rewarded by novelty. We take advantage of this in the hospital. I know you would disagree, many of you, with this, but kids actually need a whole lot less or no pain medicine after procedures if you give them a video game. I know, bad thing, but you know what? In most children's hospitals now, kids get video games after surgery because they need much less pain medication. Why? Because novelty and stimulation is extraordinarily rewarding, and exploration and puzzle solving. And you know, one of the wonderful things about being at Radcliffe is that you meet people from all different disciplines. And these happen to be three people I really admire, Esty Yeager-Lodum and Carol Armitage and Phil Klein, all of whom are on my floor. It's kind of like being on a dorm, you know, you kind of get to know them. And each of them has expressed in talks that they've given that they love the problem-solving aspect of this, and that solving a problem, whether it's 3D spatial movement of physical bodies or whether it's computational stuff that I don't understand, is really rewarding. And in fact, so rewarding that they call it beautiful. They find beauty in these problems that they solve, which tells you how rewarding it really is. Now, I live in the world of physicians, and you know your colleagues, you spend more time with your colleagues than your family. My daughter is here, so she can attest to that. And what are doctors like? I can tell you what surgeons like, by and large, most of the surgeons I know. Let's leave out the income part, and they like to have a good car and all that. Let's leave that aside for now, because those are sort of universal. But what the people in my business really get a kick out of is problem solving, and they're rewarded by altruism. And I know myself, if I'm honest, I get the biggest kick out of doing a little extra work, looking up a few other things, making a few more phone calls, doing a little bit of more research, and being right. And my residents didn't think that that was the right answer, and it was. I love that. I love that. So here we are operating and solving a problem, and we're in the operating room. We're trying to figure out which way to approach this child's brain lesion that needs to come out. This is a big team. This is all team efforts now. And it is so rewarding to solve the problem and have the child wake up and not be paralyzed. And then when the parents send you photographs, you know, fingers up, thumbs up, it is so rewarding. It is so rewarding. How can you tear yourself away from it? And now we can do fMRIs of these kinds of rewards. We can see them now. We know where they live. And they're part of the same reward network. So doctors are, at least my doctors that I know, are really rewarded by problem solving and by altruism. And this is part of our reward system. However, even this can be overtaking. So in 2007, I was chairman of the ethics committee of one of our big national organizations of pediatric neurosurgery. That happened because I missed a meeting, so they made me chairman of the ethics committee. And I said, I'll get you, I'm going to do something as I'm chairman of the ethics committee, and we're going to have a forum because this was globalization. There was a lot of interest in international outreach with neurosurgery. On the other hand, I had a mentor who once said to all of us when we were getting a little big for our britches, if all the neurosurgeons in the world went up in a puff of smoke tomorrow, the amount of human suffering that would be changed would be one drop in the vast ocean. And that's true. Neurosurgeons are not so important, despite what you hear. And it kept a perspective of mine because he said, you know, if you're really going to make a difference, you're going to go solve malnutrition and infectious diseases and population. What you do is not that important in the scheme of things. And I took that to heart. But this was a survey that I did as head of the ethics committee, giving my colleagues, about 200 of us in the country, various things to think about. Resource allocation. Should you do something if somebody has to pay out of pocket? Should you do it if the child probably isn't going to live, even if you help that suffering? Should you do it under these circumstances? And here's what was fascinating to me. They really believed that no matter how hopeless it was, they would be happy to help. This is a Likert scale, strongly disagree, strongly agree. This is number of responses. And they strongly disagreed with the concept that in a finite resource situation, you can't help everybody, it's not justified. They strongly disagreed with that. And I was surprised by this. I thought that my colleagues would have kind of a different view of the big world pictures, and they didn't, because they actually felt it was wrong to think about this stuff. They said, it's not my shift to think about resource allocation. It's not my shift to think about the planet. It's not my shift. It's my shift, like a lawyer taking care of a client, whether they're guilty or not. It's my shift to take care of that suffering that I see in front of me. And I thought that that was interesting. It's how their brains work. They're rewarded by what? Problem solving, altruism. And this other stuff, feeling like maybe we're part of the problem because we spend so much resources on so few people, is a conflict. So not my shift. I, on the other hand, still felt like it was my shift. And I felt increasingly distressed by the fact that even in medicine, which is 18% of our gross domestic product, we have enormous waste. We produce enormous carbon. We do it and feel good about it because it's helping people. One of the questions that was asked me when we did our trial balloon last year at Hughes, at the Center for the Environment, was this: just because reward circuitry and the new understanding of it is neat doesn't mean it's relevant to these questions. And I think that's a really valid question. Does neuroscience add value to understanding these behaviors? Just because I can do a functional MRI on a physician that shows up their altruism center, does this help us at all? Does it add any value to what the psychologists, who are very good at this and looking at it carefully, already do? And I think my answer is I don't know yet, but I am intrigued by the modulatability of the reward system and all the inputs. And the example that my students and I have come up with is the idea of medieval cats. Now, you're going to think I'm crazy. She said threads, but these are all over the place. So in the Middle Ages, those of you who are Middle Ages scholars know this, cats were considered a sign of the devil, that the devil actually lived in cats. And so in public squares, there was great glee taken by rounding up cats and torturing them, burning them alive, and the more they squealed and squawked and writhed in agony, the happier people were, the more they thought the devil was being squelched. You would probably, I will say with confidence, I think most of you would be horrified. This would not give you a reward. That's your reward system being modulated by context. And there's a lot written about that, largely by psychologists. But we are starting to understand how that modulation occurs because of these new insights into how the reward system makes these modulations possible. And it's an extraordinary, and I will say beautiful, system. However, we also need to know, does our individual consumption matter? Is it about what we do individually, or is it mathematically about the way we live or how corporations work and so forth? And I will say that so far, my students working on this have come up with things that suggest it's about half and half, that it is our individual behavior. It's not like that's 10% of the problem. It's somewhere in the 40 to 60% of the range, what we individually can control. And the rest of it, we would have to control through political and other means to change big things. So how about in the medical field? That's the one I live in. How about in organizations like hospitals? So again, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that now, but I'd be happy to talk to some of you. I've been talking to people at the School of Public Health. I will say that thinking about brain and climate change isn't new. I didn't know others were doing this, and that's what an exploration is all about. The American Psychological Association had a task force on this, but they were really focused more on perception of risk and the fact that it's a beautiful day out today. It's hard to perceive that environmental decline and climate change is a risk, like it is easy to perceive a tiger about to pounce on you. And that also is the way our brains evolved and how we perceive risk. There's something called the Garrison Institute, some of you may be familiar with, and they have a climate, mind, and behavior seminar. And this is a quote from their program rationale for this climate, mind, and behavior seminar. Their idea is that if we apply a behavioral lens to environmental policy and regulation and take it into account the way the human wiring has evolved, it'll be more effective. So I would say, knowing what we know about the brain, does this make sense? Is our wiring getting us into trouble? If so, can it be modified? And is it changing over time? So that's a setup for theme 3. All along the time that I've been interested in this topic, I've also been amazed at how things are changing for our young children. And when I started in my practice 30 years ago, a baby would be brought into the office by its parents with a teething toy and a stuffed animal. And now the most common thing that a baby is brought into the office with, even very young babies, 3, 4, 5 months of age, is an iPad. And at first when this started happening, I was, sort of bummed out about it. But it happened more and more and more. And even if they don't have an iPad, the parent, when the baby starts to cry, will pull out the phone and put something on the phone. And you see extraordinarily young children knowing how to swipe and point. Now, the initial reaction of those of us who are my age is to think this is bad. But it isn't necessarily bad, and that's what neuroscience does. It gives you that arm's length, is that modern life probably, in my opinion, is going to change our brains. And that's because plasticity is so robust early in life. This is one of the things I do study. Some of my lab colleagues are here today. And you know, I study it because it happens in front of my eyes. One of the things about being a neurosurgeon in pediatrics is it's a front row seat. This little boy had a 200-pound tractor tire fall on his head and crushed his head and had a severe brain injury. Here he is, still comatose, but his eyes are awake. He's in that form of coma where your eyes are awake. And here the lights have come back on. His brother's fooling around with him, and here's the recovery. This is what we see every day. This is our currency. We count on this, and we observe it, and I have never, ever gotten the least bit tired of seeing the brain recover in a child, whether it's something I did to that child or something Mother Nature or accident did. And we study this in my lab. We study how you can injure an area. There's an area of function before, after an injury goes away, and then it starts to come back somewhere else. And my colleague, Dr. Costin, studies how these cells try to reorganize. New cells are made, and at what age this occurs. But what I can tell you is all the evidence points to this is really maximal early in life. And we know this. We know this from anthropology. This slide on the left came from a colleague of mine who's a pediatrician and a cultural anthropologist, who showed me that toddlers in certain cultures can learn very early to use dangerous sharp implements to cut open fruits because they do, because they practice it, because they do. Just like Suzuki violin. You know, you don't have a kid off the street play the violin, but you can because of that plasticity. And this is the same kind of plasticity. And in fact, this new plasticity is so appealing because it appeals to so many things in our attention-getting mechanisms in our reward system all at once, that it's like nothing in nature. And that's why this violin doesn't have a chance next to that iPad. And again, I'm not saying it's evil or bad. I'm just saying it appeals to everything that we evolved to find attention getting. And that's why it's so appealing to children. So theme 3 is about plasticity in modern life. Are our brains changing? I think it's unequivocal that our brains are changing due to this kind of exposure. Is it good or bad? I'm not here to say that. It may be good and bad. It may depend on the child. It may depend on many things, and I'm not going to solve that problem, but there are people working on it. But I am curious about whether it has implications for consumption. If you are stimulated to a high level, we know your attention system can upregulate. Does it mean you need more novelty? Does more novelty translate to more stuff? Do you need more stuff? Do you need more stimulation? Are there ways to get stimulation that don't require stuff? And I've had people say, iPads are great because now you can have one device and the kid is stimulated forever and you don't have to buy any more stuff. That's one argument, could be true. So then we'll start to wrap this together. Is any of this relevant? Are any of these themes relevant? How might using a neurologic neuroscience brain lens be useful in changing behavior? And these are suggestions that others have floated, people we've studied. There's a wonderful writer, Per Stocknes, who's a Swedish psychologist who has written an entire book. It's at the Harvard bookstore, What We Think About When We're Trying Not to Think About Global Warming. His focus really is on our reaction to the idea of global warming, not our daily behavior. But his point is you have to frame the argument differently. So what I think we've come up with and others have come up with, and again, we're early on, that we can't depend on people doing with less and simplifying. That's not the way it works. But you can facilitate getting select stuff and the rewards of experience, relationships, and even the rewards of nature if you believe that biophilia is a real thing that we all have. And if you add stuff in with a bargain, it's even more rewarding. So Alice Flaherty, who was one of my collaborators on the beginning of this project, said, I get my kicks for shopping out at eBay. I can get something for $2. I get a good new thing, and I feel great about the eco side of it because it's recycled. You know, that's getting the reward and the reward, getting a double reward. You can play into social rewards. This is a lot of what Stocknes says. You can change behavior because the neighbors do it. You all get your electricity bill or your oil bill, and it says your neighbors used less or more. That turns out that stuff in the hotel about, 75% of people in rooms like yours didn't throw their towels on the floor. That stuff turns out to be quite effective when the social scientists have studied it. You can enhance community. Look at California with the water savings. Nobody thought that would happen, but they're almost in competition with the next community about who can do best. So these are the kinds of rewards you're playing into the reward system instead of telling people, just do with less. You can appeal to biophilia, something positive to get. That's a Stokeness idea, and also it's very prevalent right now in the movement for green buildings and biophilic buildings. So you get a positive thing, plus it turns out that the next bullet point down, you can incentivize with health, economic, and aesthetic benefits, because it turns out green buildings actually are better for your health. And the folks here at the Harvard School of Public Health, whom I've been communicating with, have shown that with definitive data, which is a great thing. You can capitalize on the reward system quirks, small, variable, unexpected. How about if every, 5th to 10th electricity bill, you got a bonus just for fun? You'd probably push that button like the rats do. Recognize the power of contextual plasticity, like the cat story. If the thing is framed differently, the reward, something that's very rewarding, can be horrifying and vice versa. That's our nervous system at work. It's because of all the input from the different parts of our nervous system that modulate how the rewards are valued. And really, the bottom line that we're learning as we slog through some of this really interesting stuff, I don't like the word slog, as we have the opportunity to expose ourselves to this stuff, there's a lot of it, that's where the word slog popped through my unconscious, is to do more research. There's so much that could be done about plasticity. We're also interested in adolescence, this idea of the prolonged adolescence from 18 to 25 that folks are studying. What about the consumptive behavior at that time? And I'm interested in bringing this back to the medical field to see if I can incentivize my colleagues as an experiment to add in sustainability as an additional reward to that altruism and problem solving. Finally, I want to wrap up by saying that somebody said this to me once, not knowing that this is what I do. People do interdisciplinary work because they failed at their primary job. But I would say that we evolved to be different from one another. That was a survival technique. The mixing of genes, the mixing of experience makes each of us unique. And some people have brains that like to connect dots. And I would say that's the way I have worked throughout my career. I'm going to end with this story. This little boy had epilepsy that was from a disease that is progressive. And it's an interesting disease. It's called Rasmussen's encephalitis. And the only known cure is to take out or disable half the brain. This, as luck would have it, was on the dominant side of his brain, such that if we disabled that half of his brain, he had a high risk of losing speech forever, never be able to understand or produce speech, and he would become paralyzed on his dominant side. So planning this surgery, people think neurosurgery is all about being in the operating room. It's actually all the planning and all the counseling and all the thinking about alternatives, making sure families know what you're doing. And it took about a year to get this boy ultimately to the point where his parents and the boy himself wanted surgery for his epilepsy, which was progressing. And ultimately, untreated, would have disabled him totally. So the parents went through surgery. That period of time, the hardest thing, the minutes you lose off your life in my business is the time you're finished the operation to the time the patient wakes up and you find out if they can still recognize their mother. That's where you lose off your life. And he did wake up and recognize his mother. He had to relearn to speak, although he did. And Mom sent me this photograph of him climbing up to a rocky hiking area in New Hampshire and climbing to the top of this observational fire tower. And she liked this, one, because he was determined to do it, and two, because she liked this picture because he was looking out over his future, into his future. It was symbolic to her that he did this, and she took that photograph and sent it to those of us on the team. And I will say, that tweaks your altruism reward, right? That tweaks your problem solving. We did a really innovative thing to decide what to do to this child and this big team in the operating room, trying to figure it out and make the right choices as we were doing it. It got written up in New England Journal of Medicine. It's very satisfying. And I could quit there, and we could have the violins play, and it would be a great story, and you might even get out your Kleenex. But I don't think I'm done. I don't think that's the future. That's the only future that's my responsibility. I think the rest of that future out there of all the other kids is also my responsibility. And I hope that through this exploration, maybe our team and others like you can contribute a little bit to connecting those dots. So thank you.